Hello, I'm Oscar Villalon. I'm the managing editor of ZYZZYVA, and with me today is one of our contributors to the journal, Vauhini Vara. Vauhini Vara, she is the former business editor of NewYorker.com, and now lives in San Francisco, and is a business and technology correspondent for the site. She also spent nearly a decade covering technology companies for the Wall Street Journal. She graduated with a master's from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she has received grants from the Rona Jaff Foundation and others for her fiction. Her story, We Were Here, was published last fall in ZYZZYVA issue number 101. Welcome, Vauhini. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start, I wanted to ask you a bunch of questions, not just about the story, but also about your career as a writer, as a journalist as well. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the story, We Were Here. If I could set it up, it is a story told from the point of view of presumably now a young woman recalling her childhood in an apartment complex and the lives of the various women in this place. It seems to be sort of like a world of lower middle class. I think, do I have that right? Would that be about right? With all these various travails, all these various obstacles, but gives us a sense of this strong community, particularly among the women. So I wanted to ask you, what was the origin of the story?
The origin of the story was actually not an apartment building.
Mm-hmm.
It was a story my mom told me about someone she knew. There was an older woman she knew, and so she was telling me these stories about this woman, and how she had gotten dementia, and she was getting old. And I tried to write a different story about that, but I didn't, I felt like I didn't know the woman well.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't figure out who this older woman was and who this character would be, because it was kind of mediated through the story my mom had told me, this wasn't somebody I knew. And I lived in a lot of, we lived in some houses growing up, but we also we moved around a fair amount, and so we lived in, as we were moving from place to place, we lived in a fair number of apartment buildings while I was growing up, and we were immigrants.
Sure.
And so.
Was this up in Washington?
We did live. Yeah, I grew up partly in Seattle. Okay. I went to high school in Seattle. And the story is set in Seattle. So one of them was up there. Some of them were in Canada. We lived in Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And so I think I lived in a lot of apartment buildings where other immigrants and their families also lived. And so I had this idea. I didn't realize it until after I wrote the story and read it, read it later. But I realized that these places that I had lived had found their way into the story, and somehow that had merged with the story of this character.
One of the things that appealed to us, with the lovely writing, the characters, is that there is an optimism actually to the story. Usually, when you detail the lives of people who are not the most economically secure, particularly lives of single parent mother or single mothers, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of cynicism in terms of how their lives are going to turn out. But this one, it is infused with a lot of love. Would that be right? Am I reading this correctly?
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you say that. That's it was intentional on a certain level. It's one of my most sort of optimistic or joyful stories, I think. And I wanted to do that. I was thinking, I wasn't really thinking about it on an intellectual level as I read the story, but I have thought about, I remember when I was in graduate school or something, asking a professor to sort of recommend stories or books that had that sort of that were had a sort of optimistic or joyful tone, because it was something I was interested in on an intellectual level. Mm-hmm. And I read a couple of these books, and they were all about sort of upper middle class intellectual people, who's that writer, what's her name, Laurie Colwin?
Okay.
It was a lot of these books that were recommended to me were about these sort of upper middle class intellectuals who were happy because they had pretty nice lives,
It's nice. It's easy to be happy that way.
Yeah,
Much easier, I should say. It's easier.
And so I liked the idea intellectually speaking, I like the idea of stories about people who aren't in that class, in that socioeconomic class, who sort of like lead lives that are sometimes joyful and are sometimes feel optimistic and
that meaning, and there's that sense of community.
Yeah.
And hope that things could get better.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like that sense of like the interconnectedness between all the people in the story was really important to me, I think.
Well, yeah, and it comes through. I was going to say, is this part of a larger project you're working on?
No, it's not. I mean, it is though. Like it's a weird story because I've written stories that are more autobiographical than this one, and somehow this story, which is, there are elements of, from my personal life, of course, like with any story that are in it, but it's not as autobiographical as some stories, and yet I somehow feel really close to the characters, and so, and maybe that's why, maybe the story gives that impression, and that's why you asked the question, but
Yeah.
It's not part of a novel or anything, but I've thought about it, like I feel like I could sort of like, there's much more about these characters that I could say, like I feel like I know them well, and
Sure.
I could sort of say more about their lives.
One of the things that struck me, well, as I mentioned before, you worked at the Journal for almost 10 years, now you're at NewYorker.com, and you're covering technology and stuff, and from what I understand, you've been in newspapers for a long time. You did internships at the Denver Post, you interned at the Wall Street Journal, and you were on the college paper at Stanford since you were a freshman, is that right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I thought while reading your story was this seems almost like in opposition to the sort of dourness we cultivate. I say this as a former newspaper man working in papers.
Right, right.
Where you cover certain lives and certain people, and it's mostly just the awfulness.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and our goal as newspaper people, as you know, since you have that background, is like the goal is to be as sort of like dry and unbiased in some ways, and sort of like let the facts speak for themselves as possible. And so, I do both. I do journalism and I write fiction, and in some ways, like often those two things, especially when I was working at a newspaper before I was at the New Yorker, like a lot of ways those two things, like they're completely different beasts. With fiction, like it's all about like how things feel. It's all about like saying something meaningful and infusing the words with some kind of feeling and meaning. Whereas with newspaper writing, the idea is, we'll let the facts speak for themselves, we'll let the readers draw their own conclusions. Right. Like you don't need to say how sad or happy or optimistic or pessimistic these people were, like the reader will figure it out. So yeah, I think, that's what purpose the fiction serves for me.
So I want to talk a little bit more about that, because I find it fascinating. There's an old saying in newspapers that every reporter has an unfinished novel in his or her drawer.
Yeah.
And just considering your background and how you wound up in papers, I was thinking, was there always this tension? In other words, were you one of the folks, and there's many of them, who said, you know what, it's going to be really tough to make a living off of my writing, the fiction. Maybe that job as a reporter would be a good backup.
Yeah, it's so funny you ask that. It's a very astute question, because I don't have a great memory, but I distinctly remember being in middle school and telling my mom that I wanted to be a writer. And my mom, who, my parents are very progressive and they love to read, and, they're the ones who introduced me to books, but they're also first-generation immigrants. And so my mom, and maybe any parent would say this, my mom said to me, well, if you want to be a writer, you can't be like, a novelist. You need to like go into something like journalism, because that's where you can make money in journalism. You can't make money as a story writer, which is
comparatively, comparatively speaking.
I know, right? This was like the 80s too, so it was a different, I guess, or the early 90s. It was a different time, but I somehow remembered that, and so I applied to work on my middle school newspaper, and then went and worked for my high school newspaper, and I think that offhanded comment of hers that she probably would deny ever having made, because she's very proud of me. She's happy that I'm a fiction writer and a journalist. But that offhanded comment, I think did help put the idea in my head that there are certain kinds of writing that are going to earn you a living and certain kinds of writing that won't necessarily. And it's kind of true, like now that I'm in my 30s and like I'm about to have a kid, I'm sort of like, well, that's good that I, it's,
Have these skills.
Yeah.
So what point were you at Iowa? Was this, I imagine this must have been a time when you were thinking, maybe I do want to go all in on fiction.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, I graduated, when I was in college, like you said, I worked at the Stanford Daily, this college newspaper, and I also minored in creative writing and was really serious about that, and I had this great community of writer friends, some of whom you know, and like loved both of those things. And then I graduated from college and I immediately got an internship at the Wall Street Journal, and then after that internship immediately started working at the Wall Street Journal. And so like I never had any transitional period where I was like figuring out what I wanted to do after college. I just like started doing that and was doing it.
And I imagine at the Journal too, it's a very demanding internship, so you're going all out.
Right, I was just, I just like
a lot of time for contemplation.
Totally.
I would think that, I should maybe do this. Okay, so you're at the Journal, you're working, they're working you as they work all interns.
Right.
And then you applied to Iowa?
Well, no, so I had that an internship for like a summer, and then I got a job. I got a job at the Journal, and I did that for 4 years, and then I said to myself, like I was getting into my late 20s or some mid to late 20s or something like that, and I said, okay, I've always wanted to have some period of focus on my fiction writing. I've always wanted to sort of figure out like what this means to me. It means a lot to me, but like I want to figure out if I can commit to it, at least in part, and this seems like a better time than any. Like I can't, it seems likelier that to do it in, to do it in my mid 20s seems to make more sense than anything. And so I called one of the, big editors at the Journal, the one who'd kind of recruited me to the Journal and had really nurtured my career, and I said, okay, I'm gonna leave, like I'm leaving the Journal, like I'm maybe leaving journalism, I'm gonna go do this fiction thing, bye. I'd just gotten into the Iowa Writers Workshop. And then she said to me, this was like right before everything had all fallen apart, journalism. She said to me, like, just take 2 years off and you can come back. And so I went and took 2 years and did it. Yeah, I know, right? And then I came back, and so I've had this great luxury of like getting to do both, which, wouldn't have happened in 2015.